LagimFam, you know that I am extremely critical of the Filipino criminal justice system. I criticize the police, the judges, the laws, and everything in between. Sometimes, for the sake of making a point, I draw comparisons between laws in the Philippines and other countries, England being a popular choice because I qualified and practiced law there. However, I never want anyone to think that I am being preferential for doing so. Having studied law in the UK and having kept up with British current affairs as well, I've seen how problematic their criminal justice system can be as well. There are issues that resemble those we have in the Philippines, and there are issues that are very unique to the country alone. So drawing comparisons between the two countries just makes sense to me when conveying important issues within an episode. I say all this because today's case leads us to New Zealand. This case is not only harrowing on its own, but it also clearly highlights some deeply problematic flaws in a criminal justice system that is considered relatively well-functioning and fair. This is the case of Blessie Gotingco. Mabuhay LagimFam, welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. This is episode 13 of season 4. If you are new here, welcome to the LagimFam, and if you've been here since day one, welcome back and thank you for stopping by again. If you want to know how to support me or follow me on social media, make sure to stay until the very end and to check out my show notes as well. Without further ado, let us get started with today's case. As always, details in this case might be triggering for some people. So please take care of yourself whilst listening. Saturday, the 24th of May 2014. Auckland's weather was fickle and there were scattered showers all day long. No surprise there though. It was the end of autumn after all, and winter was fast approaching for New Zealand. In Auckland's central business district, Blessie Gotingco, fondly called Blessie by family and friends, left the Tower Insurance offices where she worked as a part of the customer interaction team. It was just before 7 p.m. Blessie had planned on taking a bus back home to Birkdale, located on the North Shore. In the past, she'd catch the 7:20 bus and sometimes at the 7:40, and she most probably planned to do the same this time. She was expected to turn up at her home anytime soon. After all, she had just spoken to her son after 6 p.m., and she confirmed the same to him. So Blessie made it to the bus stop at Lower Albert Street in time for one of the two buses mentioned, but little did anybody know that danger was waiting for Blessie just before she arrived home. She actually never made it back home. Blessie had gone missing. Her daughter, who worked a late shift at her job that night, arrived at the family home at around 3:15 in the morning, noticing that her mother still had not arrived. Something felt off. She called her two brothers, and 15 minutes later, they had notified the police. As the sun rose over Auckland that Sunday morning, Blessie's family grew more and more worried by the minute. Her husband was out of the country and in the Philippines at that time, but he made sure to make his way back to Auckland when it became clear that Blessie still had not turned up. Some local news outlets had already picked up the story of Blessie's disappearance on that day, and by Monday the 26th, both major and international outlets had started covering the story of the mother of three who had gone missing seemingly very close to her house. The police had explained that Blessie's daughter tracked her mother's mobile phone via an inbuilt locator system, which showed its location as being very close to Salisbury Road, where the family lived. Blessie's daughter then decided to go along that road, where she then found some of her mom's personal items like her mobile phone, a lunchbox, and her shoes, but not the bag that contained these and other items owned by Blessie, like her Omega watch and red frame reading glasses. She then called the police to let them know that as well. At this point, this discovery could mean many things. Maybe Blessie was in an accident and was rushed to a hospital. Maybe she was in an accident and was somewhere hidden in plain sight, suffering from injuries. Maybe she was unconscious somewhere, or maybe she was taken. Despite the horrible possibilities of what may have happened to Blessie, it is sort of comforting to know that the police were not dismissive in this case. I think there have been way too many cases, both in the Philippines and internationally, where we hear about the police fobbing off families who are looking for their loved ones, telling them how they need to wait 24 or 48 hours before any action can be taken. This is a very frustrating thing to hear for families who are very worried about their loved ones. In Blessie's case, it would seem like the police did not waste time and started to gather as much information as they needed to ascertain Blessie's location. The police made sure to investigate the bus company, find the driver or drivers involved, interview as many bus passengers as possible, and obtain any valuable CCTV footage. The Gotingco family, meanwhile, was distraught, understandably so. The best the police or anyone could do for them was to provide support through the victim support scheme and continue their information gathering, as nothing was making sense in relation to Blessie's disappearance. She had no known enemies, seemed to be beloved at work and in the Filipino community as well. The whole family was your normal suburban middle-class family who lived in a part of town that did not and still does not see lots of heinous crimes. What happened to Blessie roused worry and fear in the neighbors, making them wonder if this could possibly happen to them as well, especially when it was revealed that at least one neighbor heard screaming at around 8 p.m., followed by the sound of a car driving away. The police did not want to conclude that this may have been Blessie, but the information made sure that they had their job cut out for them. The police still maintained that this case was very much a mystery. The little evidence they found near the Gotingco home indicated to them at that time that no struggle had taken place, so they in turn could not conclusively say what could have happened to Blessie. What they did say by Monday, the 26th of May, was that Blessie was not originally meant to commute. She was supposed to hitch a ride with her best friend, but Blessie declined when she decided to do some overtime instead. Whilst the police seemed quick to take action, the family and the community Blessie belonged to most probably felt like the time was passing by in a blur. The worry, the sadness, and that feeling of uncertainty can be debilitating, and sadly, for the Gotingcos, it was just going to get worse. As the end of the 26th of May drew to a close, a report came through that a body had been found in a North Shore cemetery in Auckland, the Birkenhead Glenfield Cemetery to be exact. It did not take long for the police to confirm that the body was that of 56-year-old Blessie Gotingco. It was the news that no one ever wanted to hear. By the 27th, the police were fully ready for Blessie's case to be escalated into a homicide investigation, and by the next day, a man had already been charged with murder. On this day, the police informed the public that their work on Blessie's case had now been dubbed Operation Lindsay. Under this operation, 2 possible crime scenes were being examined. The first one was at a block of apartments in Birkdale, which was where the accused man was arrested earlier, and the second scene was Birkenhead Glenfield Cemetery, a location that is just under 2 kilometers away from Blessie's home. Simultaneously, a post-mortem examination of Blessie's body was taking place as well, with the police promising initial results as soon as possible. Now, at the time when the case was being investigated, there was a court order that essentially hid the name of the accused from the media and the public. This is called a name suppression order. Furthermore, the public and the media would not really learn any of the many details about what happened to Blessie until the trial took place. So I thought it would be best to follow the chronological order of how things unfolded, which means that we will not yet get to the part about what the police found in their investigation, which inevitably includes the results of Blessie's post-mortem examination. Having said all that, let us continue with the events that took place after Blessie's body was discovered. By June 5th, 2014, Hundreds gathered as the Gotingcos laid Blessie to rest. Her family and those who have known her, worked with her, and have come to love her paid their respects at the St. Mary's Catholic Church in Northcote. Mourners could be seen wearing something green along with their funeral black to honor the mother of three who loved the green color. Blessie, as we would learn, was cremated. Now, whilst the community sort of had a pause from the burden and tension created by this tragedy and the subsequent high-profile police investigation, it still had to deal with feelings of not feeling safe in their own neighborhood. Add to that the looming trial of the accused, who was only known by the police back then, and it is understandable why people felt uneasy. By the 17th of June 2014, the media reported that the accused and suspect in this case was arraigned but refused to enter a plea. The name suppression order stayed in place, much to the disappointment of many, but especially Blessie's family and the prosecution, of course. The name suppression order was to last until the start of the trial, which was scheduled to start the following year in March. This was going to be a long wait for everyone involved, but also a time to prepare by the lawyers on both sides. In the meantime, the accused was set to appear in court for a pre-trial hearing in August 2014. By December the same year, the prosecution made it known that the still unnamed accused had been additionally charged with a sexual violation, but no further details were released. When it was time to finally get to trial in March 2015, the judge allocated to the case ordered to reschedule it for a month later, adding to the uncertainty and stress that the Gotingco family was feeling for months, on top of having to grieve over Blessie. Of course, the name suppression order was extended, so the accused remained unknown to the wider public. With this case approaching its first-year anniversary around March 2015, so many questions remained unanswered, and the most pertinent of them was, what really happened to Blessie? When the trial took place in April 2015, we finally learned what awful things Blessie had to go through the night she went missing. When Blessie left her office around 7 p.m., she made it to the bus stop just in time to catch her bus back home. She made it to the stop near her home, got off, and started walking the rest of the very short distance between that bus stop and her house. As she was walking, out of nowhere, a car came speeding towards her, and within a matter of seconds, the driver of the car deliberately drove over the curb onto the footpath and ran Blessie down, badly breaking her leg in 2 places. At this point, Blessie was incapacitated, and it is possible that as she was hit by the car, she let out a scream which was heard in the neighborhood. What no one saw, however, was how a badly injured Blessie could not defend herself when the driver of the car suddenly stopped his car, got out, and dragged Blessie all the way to his car, throwing her in it and escaping the scene with her. In the trial, Crown Prosecutor Michael Walker said the impact of the car onto Blessie was so powerful that it even caused significant damage to its bonnet and windscreen. But this did not seem to faze the defendant, who forcibly took Blessie to his home where he lived alone. Having arrived at his home, he parked the damaged car in the downstairs garage of his apartment complex and took Blessie into his unit. Blessie's nightmare was just beginning, though. Not being able to defend herself as much as she probably wanted to due to her injuries, the defendant easily overpowered her and then raped her. After raping Blessie, the post-mortem examination and the police investigation showed that the defendant then proceeded to slit Blessie's throat and stab her numerous times as if in a frenzy. Blessie died a horrific death, and the defendant, just like clockwork, proceeded to get rid of her and any evidence of his crime. Using his bed sheets, he wrapped her and took her body to the cemetery on Eskdale Road. Evidence would later show that the defendant first dragged Blessie's body through long grass and bush before dumping her and concealing her beneath a pile of shrub, leaves, and vines. Now, you might be asking, how did the police know exactly of his movements? Was there any eyewitness to this at all? No, not really. At least not like that. The defendant was wearing a GPS bracelet because, believe it or not, this man was not unknown to the police. In fact, the defendant was convicted of previous crimes that led to him wearing the bracelet in the first place. But we will get to that later because there is something to unpack in relation to that part of the story. Now, through the data collected from the defendant's GPS bracelet, the police also found out that the defendant was at the cemetery on Eskdale Road a couple of hours before he attacked Blessie. This, to the prosecutor, indicated premeditation, planning, and a clear intent to kill someone. How the police honed in on the defendant is, I think, almost by coincidence. As I understand it, because the defendant was a previously convicted offender being monitored by the Department of Corrections, who placed the bracelet on him, his movements may have raised suspicions with one detective who was involved in Blessie's case. This detective knew of the defendant being from Blessie's neighborhood as well. According to the New Zealand Herald, who I have profusely used as a source in this episode's research, the detective considered the defendant as a person of interest only hours after Blessie's disappearance. He then requested the help of the Corrections Department in regards to the defendant specifically. When the police were finally ready to make an arrest a couple of days after Blessie went missing and when her body was finally found, and also given what they now knew about the defendant and his movements, they readied themselves for a raid at the defendant's apartment. According to the reports that I've read, the police approached the defendant's apartment, rammed down his door, and stormed the apartment, catching the defendant off guard and screaming whilst being huddled under his sleeping bag on his sofa. When the police started their evidence collecting at the defendant's home after his arrest, they found a few very telling things that indicated to them that they were on the right path in terms of bringing justice to Blessie. They found a knife with traces of Blessie's blood, some bloodied towels, and a mop head, all disposed of in a wheelie bin but not hidden enough to fully conceal the evidence of a terrible crime. Chillingly, the police also found a knife that looked out of place at the defendant's apartment. This knife, upon closer inspection, had traces of blood and hair on it. Both traces were sent for testing and would later show that both blood and hair belonged to Blessie Gotingco. The defendant's car was also inspected. The detective assigned to this part of the investigation would later say in the trial that he found cuts and scratches in the leather of the passenger seats in the back of the defendant's car, as well as blood in many areas. It can be safely assumed that these specks of blood were also sent for DNA testing and came back as positive for belonging to Blessie Gotingco. Furthermore, the police found the remaining objects owned by Blessie, like her white jacket, buried in the defendant's backyard. After this point, the investigation by the police intensified until all the evidence was handed over to the prosecution for the trial in April 2015. As I said earlier, the public did not learn about a plethora of things before the trial. The short timeline I just gave earlier from the moment Blessie was run down until the defendant's arrest was not everything that we ended up learning from the trial. There was so much more that was uncovered that led to outrage amongst the wider public and added hurt to the Gotingco family. Remember that name suppression order I mentioned earlier? That would be lifted sometime in July 2015. In our timeline, we are not quite there yet, but I have decided to already reveal the defendant's name because why ever not? The defendant's name is Tony Robertson. I will talk about him in more detail much later as it is connected to what I want to say about his previous crimes for which he was made to wear a GPS bracelet. For now, let's go back to the trial where in the very early days, Robertson had decided to fire his defense lawyer and decided to represent himself, with the fired lawyer acting as his amicus curiae, a Latin word which means a friend of the court. So even though Robertson's lawyer was not technically representing him anymore, said lawyer was allowed to stay and assist the court by assisting Robertson when he'd ask for help. This was an interesting sight for those who observed the trial, but for me, there were other things that were more interesting or rather disturbing as the details of Robertson's alleged crime unfolded slowly but surely. Firstly, Robertson denied the crimes he was being accused of course. He said that he neither murdered nor raped Blessie and that her death was caused by an accident. He said that he accidentally hit Blessie with his car, then panicked and picked up her body as he did not know what to do after he realized she was very badly injured. He then started to question the police's evidence on which they based their murder allegations. He drew the court's attention to the DNA evidence. I'm not sure if he was referring to the blood traces found on objects that were found in his home or the swab samples taken from Blessie when the investigators were trying to establish whether she was raped or not. In any case, Robertson argued that the forensic team only found microscopic traces of DNA that, according to him, the forensic team struggled to isolate and test and therefore was unreliable. Robertson, cross-examining all the witnesses himself, of course, tried to cast doubt on everything that was presented by the prosecution, but I do not think he realized how strong the evidence was. In the end, it did withstand testing. There was the car repairman hired by Robertson to fix his car, who not only noticed how severely damaged the car was, but who also made note of a patch of blood on the car. Then there were Robertson's neighbors who testified about loud music coming from Robertson's apartment. Probably, this was played in an attempt to drown out Blessie's screams or any noise from her that might raise suspicion. This stood out to them because Robertson did not normally crank up the music like this, if at all. The prosecution was not lacking witnesses. It was a case that had solid legs to stand on, even though the details of how badly Blessie was hurt were completely gruesome. And this is what struck me the most when reading up on the trial. At this point, I'd like to issue another trigger warning for the graphic details that I am about to tell you. When the forensic team was called in to do a preliminary examination of Blessie at the cemetery where she was found, it was said that they found her with her top pulled up to her neck, therefore exposing her chest. Her trousers were pulled down around her thighs. Right off the bat, it was clear that Blessie was stabbed repeatedly in the neck in such a violent and frenzied manner that the pathologist would later find links of her necklace embedded inside the stab wounds. These wounds were described as very severe, measuring around 14.5 centimeters long and 2 centimeters deep. The knife used, according to the pathologist, had cut through Blessie's windpipe and thus exposed her jawbone. Blessie likely inhaled her blood at some point during the attack, as evidenced by her lungs turning a mottled and reddish color. This is called pulmonary aspiration. This told the pathologist that Blessie did not die right away from all the prior injuries she sustained, including the initial stab wounds. She was still very much breathing, but drowning in her own blood. We know this because the pathologist added how Blessie sustained further stab wounds to her ribs, with one stab wound reaching down to her lung, which was then punctured. This is likely what led to the pulmonary aspiration. Furthermore, the pathologist testified how Blessie also sustained blunt force trauma in the form of several bruises, abrasions on top of her broken jaw, and some missing teeth. Upon closer look, it would seem that Robertson may also have strangled Blessie in an attempt to subdue her or silence her. The pathologist found damaged cartilage inside her throat and burst capillaries in her eyes. Very likely signs of manual pressure applied on her throat in an attempt to asphyxiate her. Lastly, the pathologist confirmed that Blessie's left leg was broken in 2 places at a height where it was consistent with the allegation that she was hit by Robertson's car. This was a horrible list of injuries that pointed to a very painful and violent death. The only consolation that the pathologist could offer Blessie's family was the theory that Blessie's death was not prolonged. Due to the many stab wounds she sustained, the pathologist theorized that she died in a matter of minutes. Personally, I do not think this was much of a consolation, especially after the pathologist also confirmed that if Blessie's only injury had been her broken leg, she likely would have survived for days without medical treatment. Robertson's trial went on for 4 weeks. When it finally concluded, the jurors returned unanimous verdicts after hearing from over 40 witnesses. The jurors deliberated for over 2 hours and agreed that Tony Robertson was guilty of both the rape and murder of Blessie Gotingco. Months later, he would be sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 24 years for the murder. He was also sentenced to a preventative detention for the rape of Blessie. Preventative detention is when a person is detained not merely because of something they've already done, but based on an assessment that they may reoffend in the future if released. The judge, during the sentencing, said the following as to the preventative detention. Quote, "Your history makes it very plain you would be very likely to commit another qualifying offense no matter how long any finite sentence might be." End of quote. After the sentencing, a family friend of the Gotingcos released the following statement. Quote, "While no sentence can ever return Blessie to us, we are thankful this part of the legal process is completed and we can now focus on our family once again. We are forever hopeful that now this sentence has been passed down, Robertson will never walk the streets again. Blessie's death was totally preventable and highlights that the current New Zealand system does not effectively monitor high-risk offenders. Offenders like him should not be released given their extreme risk. Blessie paid for this with her life." End of quote. Tony Robertson appealed his case in 2016. He argued a few points from the trial, the first of which was that he hit Blessie accidentally. The other points, or complaints as they are formally known, were very telling. He claimed that the prosecution misled the jury, that the police set him up, that the media was against him, that his lawyers did not do a good job in representing him, and that he was not given enough time to prep his defense. He continued to claim that he did not intend to kill Blessie, that the running down was an accident, that this running down killed Blessie, that yes, he stabbed Blessie, but there was no murderous intent because she was already dead. He still denied raping her, claiming that the evidence found inside Blessie was planted. He also argued that he was high on drugs at that time, offering this as a sort of mitigating element, further arguing that he was incapable of forming an intent because he was high as a kite. Most of these arguments were heard during his trial and were obviously not convincing enough for the jurors who decided that he was guilty after all. Now, the Court of Appeal did not accept Robertson's complaints except for one. That was the possibility that he may have hit Blessie with his car accidentally and not deliberately. They said, quote, "Although it may not have been planned, the murder was calculated. He sought to escape detection by murdering Mrs. Gotingco and hiding her body. He committed rape as well as murder, and Mrs. Gotingco suffered greatly." End of quote. Robertson then tried to convince the Court of Appeal in 2019 to overturn his conviction, but the court refused to hear his appeal, and it was subsequently dismissed. So you might think that was it. That concludes the story of Blessie Gotingco, and you would be forgiven for thinking so. However, around a month after Robertson lost his appeal, a report came out that absolved the Department of Corrections of any mishandling of Tony Robertson's case. You're probably thinking, what on earth am I talking about? The Department of Corrections? What is Tony Robertson's case? Well, I will have to take you back to at least 2005, so this will all make sense later. Tony Robertson was born in 1987. Now, I'm not going to dedicate countless minutes to humanize or tell you his whole life story, but I'll have to sneak in some infos here and there for context. Early in his childhood, his father left him and his mother. As a kid, people who knew Robertson had fond memories of him being obedient, caring, and funny. But this all changed by the time he hit his teenage years. His teens would be full of convictions ranging from assault, aggravated robbery, possession of an offensive weapon, willful damage, burglary, and threatening to kill. And then it was December 2005. Robertson was 18 years old and he was accused of his first serious crime, for which he was eventually found guilty. According to reports at that time, he had lured a 5-year-old girl into his car and then drove her to a nearby isolated car park. The police were already looking for this child as this was all happening, so they were on high alert, and a police officer happened to turn up at the same car park, catching Robertson leaning over the girl with his boxer shorts already on the floor. For this heinous and disgusting crime, he was jailed for 7 years and 6 months for the abduction and molestation of the girl. This sentence was extended for another half year because Robertson had assaulted a prison guard whilst serving his original sentence. Robertson denied the allegations and professed his innocence, saying that he was set up. Sounds familiar? Anyway, by December 2013, Robertson was released from jail. He had a support system, and his mother, who had been living in Australia just before his release, even flew to Auckland and stayed there to set him up with what he needed as he transitioned back into society. She really did not have to though, because Robertson was initially housed in a sort of halfway home as he was supposed to be reintegrated into society. But he broke their house rules and therefore had to exit that home prematurely. His mother then provided him with a 2-bedroom apartment in Birkdale, the same neighborhood as Blessie's. Other family members also helped him by providing him with a car and other things that would help him start his new life. He then tried to look for jobs, which according to those who knew him was not an easy task. Now let us backtrack a little bit. His release from prison did not mean that he could do as he pleased. He was a convicted person after all. So when he was released, there were very strict conditions that were imposed on him because he was deemed as a danger to society. Mind you, these were not the strictest set of conditions at all, and yet in a matter of a few weeks, he managed to breach these conditions, so much so that the corrections department had to throw him in jail for a month before releasing him again into civilization. The Department of Corrections then applied to the court for an extended supervision order for Robertson, meaning that if granted by the courts, Robertson would be under surveillance for the next decade, yes, 10 years, under the strictest of conditions that a New Zealand court could allow in such a case. The Corrections Department had reason to be worried. Robertson was and is considered to be impulsive, unable to control his anger and aggression, and we now know that he has a predilection for and proclivity towards sexual offending, as one judge put it. And he has never taken any responsibility for his actions, a deadly combination for anyone who has just been released into society from prison. Just to put this whole thing into perspective and how infuriating this case is, the application for the extended supervision order that would allow the Department of Corrections to put Robertson under surveillance for a decade was lodged in February 2014. He already had a GPS tracker bracelet by then, but this was not meant to be worn for the next 10 years if the court did not approve that order I just mentioned. By March, there was a suspicion that he may have behaved indecently towards a child in his neighborhood, but he was cleared of this. By May, he abducted, raped, and murdered Blessie. By June, the courts were supposed to finally approve the extended supervision order, but by then it was a little bit too late, especially for Blessie. What really angers me is that when Robertson was still in prison, he underwent psychological assessments. Listen to this excerpt from a report I found in Radio New Zealand. Quote, "A psychologist's report shortly before his release from prison in 2013 found Robertson had a high risk of reoffending. It concluded he was hostile towards women, had a sense of social rejection, a lack of concern for others, and deviant sexual preferences. End of quote. The Department of Corrections knew exactly what kind of person Robertson was. They GPS monitored him, knew where he was every second of the day, but still could not stop him from destroying the lives of the Gotingcos forever. So what is the point of a GPS bracelet monitor if you are really not monitoring your subject? Now, my heart breaks for the Gotingcos because Blessie's murder was entirely preventable for all the reasons I have just mentioned. The Department of Corrections experienced a huge backlash during the Robertson trial and afterwards. People asked the same questions I asked when I started reading up on the case. Why did they not place him under the strictest of supervision orders as soon as he left prison? Why wait until much later, only when he already breached his release conditions? After all, the Department of Corrections knew that this person was and is a serious offender, potential reoffender, and sexual deviant. Here's another kicker. The Corrections Department admitted that even the strictest of orders may have still not stopped this monster from reoffending. So isn't that all the more reason to monitor him closely, put more eyes on him, and be very meticulous in accounting for his movements every minute of the day? Shouldn't the GPS bracelet be just one of perhaps many ways to monitor him in order to be sure that the community is safe? Should there perhaps been some physical presence monitoring Robertson for these reasons? Also, how on earth did they actually monitor him? Did they do regular surveillance, random drop-bys, visits? If they did not do this, was it therefore a question of lack of resources or staff? Did they monitor so many ex-cons in that area that they did not find time in their day to look into a sexual offender of children? I mean, how did it all work? Was there a probation officer in place, or is that something that is not normally offered in New Zealand? Obviously, I'm very deeply enraged and incensed because there were so many points in this timeline between Robertson's release and the day he murdered Blessie when the Department of Corrections could have taken very drastic measures to keep this monster out and keep the community safe, but they did not. I also understand, however, that like in a lot of legal systems, once a person has completed their sentence and just because we think the person should not be let out in the wild, we simply cannot continue to imprison them preventatively. That is a breach of basic human rights, but that is why we have other measures like supervision orders, tech like GPS, and other things that can still help keep everyone safe as much as possible without breaching an ex-con's human rights. Now, let me leave this section of the episode with this last piece of infuriating information. When the Corrections Department was asked why they did not raise the alarm despite seeing Robertson's movements that night when he killed Blessie, they said that he was within a geographical area where he was allowed to move freely as per his release conditions. Since no one had eyes on him and because the department only relied on the data being transmitted from Robertson's GPS tracker, no one was the wiser to what Robertson was actually doing in his own neighborhood. When an inquiry was initiated by the government to look into what the Corrections Department may have done wrong, the embattled department was absolved of all wrongdoings. As per an official report that was published later, no gaps or lapses in monitoring were identified in the actions of the Corrections Department. This broke the hearts of those who loved Blessie, especially her family. Here is the statement read out by Antonio Gotingco, Blessie's husband, after the government report was published.
Now, with immense dignity, today he read his statement.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My family and I are both disappointed and devastated by the inquiry's findings. Having reviewed the report and all the evidence at trial, we remain firmly of the view that the Department of Corrections' ineptitude enabled that evil killer to take our Blessie. It is glaringly obvious to us and the wider public that they do not have the capability to manage these high-risk sex offenders. In fact, I think the offenders manage them. How this was not investigated by the report astounds us. We are now going to regroup and think about next steps in our journey for justice for Blessie. Thank you for your time, and please respect our family's privacy at this difficult time.
Blessie Gotingco was loved by her community, her work colleagues, and of course, her family. She was often described as kind, open-hearted, and fun in reports I've read for this episode. Her son Vincent described her as being simply the best, a devoted mother to her children. The hole she left behind in the hearts of those who had the privilege of knowing her kindness, and her radiance will be difficult to fill. She was taken away before her time by someone who has little to no regard for the sanctity of human life. I once read that the Gotingcos described the feeling of losing Blessie as something akin to being lost in darkness forever. I hope that this feeling will not last forever, though. I hope that wherever the Gotingcos are on this planet, they have found support, love, and peace despite the devastation that they had experienced in their lives. I hope that they will find the light amidst the darkness and cast that darkness back onto the person that took their lovely Blessie away from them, because he, for sure, deserves it 1,000 times over. Thank you so much, LagimFam, for listening to yet another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. As always, I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you do, make sure to rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify, because it does help with making my podcast more visible to those who do not know about it yet. Also, make sure to follow me on all my socials. Check the show notes for all the links to my Insta, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook accounts. Until next episode, thank you so much, LagimFam. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.